Welcome to the case of the night visitor of Baker Street. I am your host, Sherlock Holmes's friend and companion, Dr. John Watson. Tonight's story begins not with a crime, but with a warning, a message delivered without a sound, a man who appears only in the dead of night, watching, waiting, measuring, and a presence we could not see, yet could not ignore. Before we begin, tell me, from which city are you watching tonight? And what is your favourite Sherlock Holmes story? You can also listen to these mysteries on Spotify. But for now, return with me to Baker Street, where a man who never knocked had already begun. Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Knocked. It was in the final days of October, in the year 1895, that a matter of singular peculiarity first presented itself to us at 221B Baker Street, a matter which, in its earlier stages, bore none of the hallmarks of danger, yet which would prove, before its conclusion, to be among the most cunningly engineered conspiracies I have ever had occasion to record. I'd returned that evening from a long day at my practice in Paddington, where a succession of bronchial complaints and one rather theatrical case of gout had consumed the better part of my patience. The fog had settled over London with that particular thickness which renders even the familiar strange, and I was grateful to find the sitting-room lit and warm, the fire recently stoked, and Holmes seated in his customary chair beside the window, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He did not greet me. This was not unusual. When Holmes was in the grip of thought, the social courtesies became to him an expenditure of energy he could not justify. I removed my coat, poured myself a measure of brandy, and settled into my own chair opposite him. The evening edition of the Times lay folded on the side table untouched. I reached for it. "You may read it if you wish," Holmes said, without shifting his gaze, "from the window. But you will find nothing of interest. The world, it seems, has decided to be dull." "Then I should think you would welcome the rest," I replied. "Rest is the enemy of the mind, Watson. A mind at rest is a mind in decay." He unfolded himself from the chair with that sudden, restless energy I knew so well, and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he stood examining a small envelope I had not previously noticed. It was unremarkable, cream-coloured, unsealed, with no postmark and no return address. Upon it, in a hand that was careful but not refined, was written simply, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street." "When did that arrive?" I asked. "It did not arrive, Watson. That is precisely what interests me. It appeared." I confess, I did not immediately grasp his meaning. He turned the envelope over in his fingers, studying the paper with that intense, narrowed focus, which transformed his sharp features into something almost predatory. "Mrs. Hudson did not bring it up." "No." Messenger was seen at the door. "The post came at 2:30, and this was not among it. Yet when I returned from the British Museum at 4:45, it was here, on the mantelpiece, leaning against the clock, as though it had been placed by someone who knew the room intimately." A faint chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the October fog. "What does it contain?" Holmes withdrew a single sheet of paper. Upon it were written 4 lines in the same careful hand. "You are holding something that does not belong to you. It was entrusted, not earned. Return it, and no harm will follow. Ignore this, and I shall come for it myself." There was no signature, no emblem, no indication whatsoever of the author's identity. "A threat?" I said. "An announcement," Holmes corrected. "A threat implies uncertainty, a hope that fear will accomplish what action cannot. This is different. This is a man telling me what he intends to do. He has already decided. The letter is not a negotiation. It is a courtesy." I studied his expression for some sign of concern and found none. If anything, I detected a flicker of that dangerous satisfaction which arose in him only when the game promised genuine complexity. "And what is it that you are supposedly holding?" Holmes set the letter down and gestured broadly at the room, at the shelves overflowing with case files, the stacks of correspondence, the locked dispatch box beside the desk, the scattered documents and curios that constituted the accumulated debris of a decade's worth of consultations. "That, Watson, is the question. I'm holding a great many things that do not belong to me. Half the secrets of London pass through this room at one time or another. The question is not what, but who believes I have something worth tunnelling through courtesy to retrieve." He used the word tunnelling casually, almost absently, and I thought nothing of it then. It would be some days before I understood how precisely he had chosen it. I slept poorly that night. The letter had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Holmes, by contrast, seemed invigorated. I heard him moving about the sitting room well past midnight, the irregular creak of the floorboards, the scratch of his pen, the occasional murmur of self-directed conversation that signalled his mind was at full operation. It was the following morning that the second peculiarity revealed itself. I was descending the stairs for breakfast when I encountered Mrs. Hudson on the landing, her expression one of polite bewilderment. "Dr. Watson," she said, "did you happen to notice anyone at the front door last evening, around 6:30? "I did not. Why do you ask?" "Only that I found the latch undone this morning. Not forced, simply undone, as though someone had opened it from inside and neglected to secure it again. And there were marks on the step, boot prints, fresh, but of a sort I did not recognize, heavy, deliberate, not the prints of a man in a hurry." I thanked her and carried this information upstairs to Holmes, who received it with a single, sharp nod. "Deliberate," he repeated. "Yes, that is the word. Our correspondent is not a man who acts in haste. He observes, he measures, he prepares." "You speak as though you know him." "I know his type, which is more useful than knowing his name. A name is a label. A type is a prediction." He rose and went to the window, drawing back the curtain to study the street below. Baker Street was alive with its usual morning commerce, cabs, pedestrians, a boy selling newspapers on the corner. Nothing out of the ordinary. And yet Holmes stood there for a long while, watching. "There," he said at last. I joined him at the window. "Where? I see nothing." "Precisely. You see nothing because there is nothing to see, now. But 12 minutes ago, a man stood on the opposite pavement, just beside the lamp-post. He stood there for approximately 9 minutes. He did not hail a cab. He did not enter any shop. He did not consult a watch or appear to wait for anyone. He simply stood and looked. At what? At this building, Watson, at this very window. And when he turned to leave, he did something most instructive. He looked down. Down? At the ground. Not at the pavement in the way one watches one's footing, but at the ground itself, as though confirming something he already knew, as though he were checking the surface against a measurement he carried in his mind. Holmes let the curtain fall. "I want you to understand something, Watson. This man, whoever he is, did not knock. He did not ring. He did not present a card or seek an audience. He delivered his message by entering our rooms without detection, and he returned the next morning to observe the result. This is not a client. This is not a petitioner. This is a man who has already begun." "Begun what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He crossed to his desk and began to sort through a stack of documents, papers from recent cases, correspondence from solicitors, reports from Scotland Yard. He paused over one folder, unmarked, which I knew contained materials entrusted to him by various parties for safekeeping, documents too sensitive to remain in the hands of their owners. There is a confession in here, Watson, given to me 3 weeks ago by the executor of a recently deceased baronet, Sir Malcolm Cray. The name was not unfamiliar to me. Sir Malcolm had died the previous month, ruled a suicide by the coroner's inquest, though the circumstances had attracted some murmured speculation in the clubs. His executor believed the document too dangerous to file with the estate. He asked me to hold it until the appropriate authorities could be discreetly consulted. I agreed. And you believe this is what our visitor wants? I believe it is what someone wants. Whether our visitor knows exactly what he seeks, or merely that something of value resides here that I have not yet determined. He closed the folder and locked it in the dispatch box with a key he wore on his watch chain. We shall see, Watson. A man who never knocks is a man who believes doors are beneath him. Such men are either supremely confident or supremely desperate. In either case, he paused and a faint cold smile crossed his lips. They tend to make the most interesting adversaries. That evening, as I sat reading by the fire, I became aware of a sensation I could not immediately identify, a subtle wrongness in the room, as though some element of its familiar geometry had shifted by a fraction too small to name. I glanced about. Everything appeared to be in its place. The books, the chemical apparatus on the side table, the chairs, and yet I looked at my own chair, the one in which I sat every evening, and noticed, or believed I noticed, that it sat not quite level. A tilt, barely perceptible, as though the floor beneath it had settled minutely to one side. I dismissed it as imagination, the product of an evening spent in anxious contemplation. I know now that I should not have dismissed it, but that knowledge, like so much else in this affair, would come only later, when the full scope of what lay beneath our feet had been revealed. Chapter 2. A Pattern in the Darkness. 3 days passed without incident, and I confess that I had begun to hope the matter of the anonymous letter might prove to be nothing more than an ill-conceived attempt at intimidation, the work of some disgruntled party whose grievance with Holmes had curdled into melodrama. London produced such individuals with dispiriting regularity, and most of them, when met with silence, retreated into the obscurity from which they had briefly emerged. Holmes, however, did not share my optimism. If anything, the silence seemed to sharpen him. He had acquired, in those 3 days, a new habit which I found quietly unnerving. Each evening, after Mrs. Hudson had retired and the house had settled into its nocturnal stillness, he would extinguish every lamp in the sitting-room, position himself in the chair beside the window, and sit motionless in the dark for hours. He did not smoke. He did not speak. He simply listened, with that preternatural concentration which I had seen him bring to bear on the faintest of evidence, the most delicate of deductions. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, I descended from my bedroom to find him in precisely this posture. The fire had burned to embers, casting a faint amber glow across the rug and nothing more. Holmes was a silhouette against the grey rectangle of the window, utterly still. "Sit down, Watson," he said, without turning, "and do not speak." I did as instructed. The chair creaked as I settled into it, and Holmes raised one finger, a sharp, silent admonishment. I held my breath. For several minutes, there was nothing. The house made its usual sounds, the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, the occasional groan of old timber adjusting to the cold, the distant rattle of a cab on the street below. I was on the verge of concluding that Holmes had succumbed to an excess of vigilance when I heard it, or rather, I felt it. It was not a sound in the conventional sense. It was a vibration, deep and faint, transmitted through the floor and up through the frame of my chair into the base of my spine, a rhythmic pulse, not constant, but measured. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, a pause, as though somewhere beneath us something was striking the earth with mechanical precision. I opened my mouth. Holmes's hand closed on my wrist with startling force. We sat in silence for what must have been 20 minutes. The vibration continued, steady, unhurried, disciplined. Then it stopped, not gradually, not with any faltering, but cleanly, as though a switch had been thrown. Holmes released my wrist. "How long have you been hearing that?" I whispered. 4 nights. 4? Good, Lord Holmes. Why did you not tell me? Because until tonight, I was not certain it was real. The human body is a poor instrument for detecting subterranean vibration. The ear hears what it expects, and the mind obliges with confirmation. I needed a second body, a second set of nerves, to verify what mine reported. He paused. "You felt it?" I did, distinctly. "Describe it." "A tremor. Rhythmic. Beneath the floor. Like distant hammering, but muffled, controlled." "Controlled?" Holmes repeated, and in the darkness I heard the satisfaction in his voice. "Yes, that is the operative word, not the irregular percussion of settling foundations or shifting pipes, not the vibrations of street traffic, which are erratic and directionally inconsistent. This is mechanical. This is deliberate. Someone, Watson, is working beneath us." The implications of this statement settled over me with the weight of the fog outside. "Working? You mean digging?" "I mean precisely that. But that is impossible. We are in the heart of London. The ground beneath Baker Street is a labyrinth of sewers, gas mains, water pipes, and older things, forgotten things. Coal cellars that have not been opened since the reign of William IV. Maintenance passages built for infrastructure that was decommissioned decades ago. London is not one city, Watson. It is a dozen cities stacked atop one another, each generation building upon the bones of the last and forgetting what lies beneath. He rose and moved to the desk, where he lit a single candle, shielding the flame with his hand so that it cast only a narrow circle of light, and unfolded a large map which I recognized as an ordnance survey of the Marylebone district. "I have spent the past 2 days at the offices of the Metropolitan Board of Works," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "Here is Baker Street. Here, running parallel, is Dorian Lane, a minor thoroughfare, largely residential, unremarkable in every respect save one." He tapped a point on the map. "Number 14. Dorian Lane was, until 1867, the premises of a coal merchant named Sefton. When the business closed, the property was converted to residential use. But the coal cellar, a substantial underground chamber, was never filled. It was simply sealed and forgotten. And from that cellar, Watson, there runs a maintenance passage, narrow, brick-lined, constructed in 1843 for access to a gas main that was decommissioned in 1871. And this passage runs toward Baker Street. It runs beneath it, or very nearly so. The original engineering plans show the passage terminating some 40 feet short of this building, but 40 feet to a man with skill and resources is not an obstacle. It is an invitation. I stared at the map, trying to comprehend the audacity of what Holmes was suggesting. "You are telling me that someone is digging a tunnel to reach this building, to reach these rooms?" "I am telling you that someone has been digging for weeks. The vibrations I detected 4 nights ago were not the beginning of the work. They were its middle stages, perhaps its final stages. The rhythm is too confident, too practiced for early excavation. These are men who know exactly where they are going." He folded the map and extinguished the candle. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall take a walk." The walk, as it transpired, took us to Dorian Lane. It was a quiet street, respectably shabby, lined with terraced houses whose front steps had not been swept with any great enthusiasm. Number 14 was indistinguishable from its neighbours, a narrow-fronted house with drawn curtains and a brass knocker that had long since lost its polish. A sign in the ground floor window read, "Rooms to let. Inquire within." Holmes did not approach the house directly. Instead, we walked the length of the lane at a measured pace, and I understood that he was not merely observing, he was correlating. Every few steps, his gaze would drop to the ground, then rise to the roof lines, then return to the pavement. He was reading the street the way a surveyor reads terrain, and I knew better than to interrupt. We paused at the corner, where a small public house called the Lamb and Shuttle offered a convenient pretext for lingering. Holmes ordered 2 ales and positioned us at a table by the window. "The house is occupied," he said, "recently. The curtains are new, inexpensive, but recently hung. The step has been swept, but only in the centre, suggesting a single occupant who enters and exits by the same path. And there is a smell." "A smell?" You did not notice it as we passed. Faint but distinctive. Earth. Not the surface earth of a garden. Deep earth. The sort of clay one encounters only at significant depth. It clings to clothing, to boots, to the fibres of a doormat. Someone in that house has been spending a great deal of time underground. I'd noticed nothing of the kind, but I had long since ceased to be surprised by the acuity of Holmes's senses. "There is something else," he continued, lowering his voice. As we walked, I observed a man on the far side of the street. Tall, lean, military-bearing. He was walking in the opposite direction, but his pace matched ours precisely, not following, but monitoring, and when he reached the end of the lane, he paused. I remember. He stopped to adjust his glove. He stopped to look at the ground, Watson, at the specific point where the pavement meets the curb, directly above the line of the old maintenance passage. He was not adjusting his glove. He was confirming the route. He was checking the surface for any sign of subsidence, any indication that the work below had disturbed the ground above. Holmes took a slow draught of his ale. That man knows this street the way a captain knows his ship. He has walked it dozens of times. He has memorized every crack in the pavement, every drain cover, every irregularity. And he looked down. Watson, always down. A man who looks down is not lost in thought. He's thinking about what lies beneath his feet. Did you see his face? Clearly enough. Late 40s, clean-shaven, a scar along the left jaw, old, well-heeled, consistent with a blade or shrapnel. His coat was good but not fashionable, the coat of a man who values function over appearance. His boots were exceptional. Exceptional? Reinforced soles, rubber-tipped, designed for silence. Those are not the boots of a gentleman taking his constitutional, Watson. Those are the boots of a man who moves through confined spaces and does not wish to be heard. He set down his glass. "We are not being watched, Watson. We are being measured." The words landed with quiet force. I looked out of the window at the unremarkable street, the unremarkable houses, and I felt the ground beneath my feet become, in my imagination, thin and uncertain, a mere crust over darkness. "What do you propose to do?" I asked. "For the moment, nothing." "Nothing?" "Nothing visible. I shall not approach the house. I shall not confront the man. I shall not alert the police. To act now would be to reveal what I know, and what I know is, at present, my only advantage." He leaned back in his chair, and I saw in his grey eyes that particular light which I had come to recognize over many years, the cold, lucid flame of a mind that has found its quarry and is content, for now, to wait. This man is not a common criminal, Watson. He is precise. He is patient. He is operating on a timetable, and he believes himself entirely undetected. I intend to let him continue believing that, right up until the moment it is too late for him to retreat. And if he reaches whatever it is he is after before you are ready?" Holmes smiled. a thin, blade-like expression that held no warmth. He will not, because I already know what he wants. And I know something else, Watson, something far more valuable. What is that? I know that he is not working alone. A man does not dig a tunnel beneath London by himself. He requires labour, funding, expertise, and above all, a reason powerful enough to justify the risk. Our visitor is a soldier, a very good one, but soldiers follow orders. He stood, dropping a coin on the table. Somewhere above this affair there is a general, and that, Watson, is the man I intend to find. We walked home in silence through the thickening fog. As we turned onto Baker Street, I glanced back, an instinct I could not suppress, and saw, or thought I saw, a tall figure standing at the far end of Dorian Lane, perfectly still, watching us go. When I mentioned it to Holmes, he merely nodded. Yes, he said, he wants us to know he is there. It is a message. What sort of message? Holmes unlocked the door and stepped inside. The sort that says, I am not afraid of you. He paused on the threshold and looked back at the street, at the fog, at the invisible geometry of the city beneath our feet. He should be. Chapter 3. The Street Above Silence. In the days that followed our visit to Dorian Lane, Holmes entered one of those periods of intense self-contained industry which rendered him almost entirely inaccessible to ordinary conversation. He rose before dawn and returned after dark, offering no explanation for his absences and tolerating no inquiry. His meals went untouched. His correspondence accumulated in drifts upon the desk. The only evidence of his activities was the state of his clothing, mud on his trouser cuffs, chalk dust on his sleeves, and on one occasion a pungent smell of lamp oil and damp brick that clung to him like a second skin. I knew better than to press him. When Holmes was working at this pitch, interruption was not merely unwelcome, it was physically dangerous to the interrupter. I contented myself with maintaining the routines of the household, attending to my practice, and keeping a careful record of any developments that might prove relevant. There were, as it happened, several. On the morning of November the 3rd, I received a visit at my consulting rooms from a woman I had not previously met. She gave her name as Mrs. Genevieve Paris, and presented herself with the quiet self-possession of a person accustomed to being taken seriously. She was perhaps 45, dressed in morning clothes of good quality, and she carried a small leather portfolio which she placed upon my desk with the care one might afford a sleeping child. I understand you are an associate of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, she said. I am his friend and colleague, yes. Then perhaps you can assist me. I've been attempting to secure an audience with Mr. Holmes for nearly a week. I've written twice and called once at Baker Street. On each occasion, I was told he was unavailable. This did not surprise me. Mrs. Hudson, under Holmes's standing instructions, had been turning away all visitors during his present preoccupation. May I ask the nature of your business? She hesitated, not from uncertainty, I thought, but from a careful weighing of how much to reveal. I was a close acquaintance of Sir Malcolm Cray, she said. I believe Mr. Holmes is in possession of certain papers relating to Sir Malcolm's estate. I wish to discuss them. The name struck me with the force of a cold draught. I kept my expression neutral, a skill one develops in medical practice, but my mind was already racing. Here, presenting herself voluntarily, was a woman connected to the very matter that had drawn a tunnel beneath our sitting room. May I ask your relationship to Sir Malcolm? I was his confidential secretary for 11 years. I managed his private correspondence, his financial records, and his personal affairs. I knew him, Dr. Watson, better than his own family knew him, and I believe I know the truth about his death. She opened the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, a letter written in a hand I did not recognize. This was among Sir Malcolm's private effects. It was not included in the materials given to the executor, because I removed it before the estate was catalogued. I have kept it safe ever since. I did not reach for the letter. Something in her manner, an intensity beneath the composure, made me cautious. Mrs. Parris, I must be candid with you. I am not at liberty to discuss any materials that may or may not be in Mr. Holmes's possession, but I will convey your request to him, and I am certain he will wish to speak with you at the earliest opportunity. She studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed, not unkindly, but thoroughly. You are loyal to him, she said. That is admirable. But loyalty, Doctor, can also be a kind of blindness. There are things about Sir Malcolm's death that Mr. Holmes does not know, things that change the meaning of whatever document he holds. I am not his enemy. I may, in fact, be the only ally he has in this affair. She returned the letter to her portfolio, rose, and handed me a card with an address in Kensington. When he is ready, she said, I shall be waiting. I reported the encounter to Holmes that evening. He had returned in a state of considerable dishevelment, his collar loosened, his hair disordered, and a fresh tear in the knee of his trousers that suggested he had been crawling through spaces not designed for human passage. He listened to my account without interruption, standing before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames. Describe her hands, he said when I had finished. I beg your pardon? Her hands, Watson. You are a physician. You observe hands instinctively. What did you notice? I cast my mind back. They were well kept. No rings, though there was a faint indentation on the left ring finger, suggesting one had been recently removed. Ink stains on the right index and middle fingers, habitual, deeply set, the hands of a woman who writes a great deal. A secretary's hands, Holmes murmured, or a forger's. The word startled me. You think she is involved. I think nothing yet, but consider, Watson. Sir Malcolm's confession was entrusted to me precisely because it was too dangerous to leave with the estate. Now a woman appears, unsolicited, voluntarily, claiming intimate knowledge of the dead man's affairs, and carrying a document she admits to having removed from his effects before they were catalogued. She speaks of truths I do not know. She positions herself as an ally. He turned from the fire. In my experience, Watson, those who announce themselves as allies before they have been tested are either genuinely courageous or profoundly calculating. I shall need to determine which. Will you see her? In time. Not yet. She is a thread, Watson. An important one, but she is not the thread I am currently following. He crossed to the desk where a fresh set of documents had been laid out. Maps I saw of a more detailed character than those he had previously consulted. These were not ordnance survey sheets, but engineering schematics, yellowed with age, covered in precise notations and measurements. I spent the day at the Public Record Office, he said, and then in the tunnels themselves. You went below ground, through a service entrance near Regent's Park. The old maintenance passage is still accessible, partially collapsed in places, but navigable. I followed it as far as I dared. He traced a line on one of the schematics. The passage runs southeast from Dorian Lane, beneath the rear gardens of the terrace, and terminates here, approximately 40 feet from the northwest corner of this building. The original brickwork ends at a crude wall of packed earth and rubble, installed when the passage was decommissioned. And beyond that wall? Beyond that wall, Watson, someone has been very busy, indeed. The earth has been recently disturbed. I could see the marks of excavation, clean cuts, professionally executed, with timber shoring to prevent collapse. Whoever is directing this work has engineering training. This is not the labour of amateurs. This is military precision. He said the last two words with a particular emphasis that told me he had already formed a hypothesis about the identity of our adversary. The man from Dorian Lane, I said. The one with the silent boots. Edgar Voss. Holmes spoke the name as though testing its weight. I have spent some effort in establishing his identity. He is a former officer of the Royal Engineers, decorated, capable, and dismissed from service 3 years ago under circumstances that were quietly suppressed. The official record states, conduct unbecoming. But the true reason, I suspect, is rather more specific. What reason? He was involved in a scheme to divert military construction funds, a relatively modest fraud, but one which required the complicity of a superior officer. The superior was never named. Voss was removed, given a pension sufficient to ensure his silence, and released into civilian life with skills that are, shall we say, highly transferable. Holmes sat down and filled his pipe, the old black clay, which he favoured when thinking through problems of unusual complexity. A man who can build fortifications in hostile terrain can certainly dig a tunnel beneath a London street. A man who has been betrayed by his superiors and left to absorb the consequences alone is a man with grievances. And grievances, Watson, make excellent fuel for dangerous enterprises. You believe he is working for whoever protected him during the military scandal? I believe he is working for someone with the resources to fund an operation of this scale, and the motive to retrieve Sir Malcolm Creye's confession before it reaches official hands. The tunnel alone would require several £1,000s. Equipment, labour, materials, a lease on the Dorian Lane property. This is not the work of a dismissed officer living on a military pension. He struck a match and held it to the pipe, drawing slowly until the tobacco caught. There is a figure behind Voss, a man of means, of influence, and of considerable nerve. A man who stood to lose everything if Sir Malcolm's confession were made public, because it names him. It identifies him as the architect of the fraud that destroyed Creye, and as the hand that ensured Creye's silence when the fraud threatened to unravel. You have read the confession, then? I have read it, Watson, thoroughly, and I begin to understand why someone would go to such extraordinary lengths to make it disappear. He fell silent for a time, smoking, staring at nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had risen, and I could hear it pressing against the windows with a low, insistent moan. There is something else, I said, and I told him of a small matter I had noticed that afternoon, so trivial that I had nearly forgotten it. While Holmes had been away, I had received a visit from a young man named Alistair Crewe, a clerk at the firm of solicitors that had handled Sir Malcolm's estate. He had come, he said, on a routine matter, to confirm that certain documents remained in Holmes's custody, and to obtain a receipt for the executor's records. I had told him that Holmes was unavailable, and suggested he return the following week. He had thanked me politely and departed, but as he left he had paused on the front step and looked up and down Baker Street, with an expression I could only describe as frightened. Holmes listened to this account with sharpened attention. Describe him! Young, 25 at most, slight build, fair-haired, nervous in manner, well-dressed but not expensively so. His hands trembled when he took out his card. And you say he looked frightened? Distinctly. He seemed to be watching for someone, or watching to make sure he had not been followed. Holmes removed the pipe from his lips. A frightened clerk from the firm handling Creye's estate, a confident woman claiming to be Creye's secretary, and beneath our feet a former military engineer digging his way toward this room. 3 threads, Watson, from 3 different directions, all converging on the same point. He rose and went to the window. The street below was dark, the gas lamps reduced to faint halos in the fog. He stood there for a long time, his reflection a ghost in the glass. I want you to do something for me, Watson. Name it. Tomorrow morning, I want you to walk the length of Baker Street, from the Marylebone Road to the park, at a slow, observational pace. Note every workman, every delivery, every open drain cover, every vehicle that remains stationary for longer than 5 minutes. I want a complete inventory of the street's visible activity. You suspect the tunnel has a second access point. I suspect nothing. I observe and I accumulate. The street above Silence, Watson, has its own story to tell, and I have been so occupied with what lies below that I have neglected what lies in plain sight. He turned from the window and fixed me with that penetrating grey gaze. One more thing. If Mrs. Parris contacts you again, accept her invitation. Go to Kensington, hear what she has to say, but tell her nothing whatsoever about what we have heard beneath these floors. You do not trust her. I do not yet know her, Watson, which is quite a different thing. Trust is the conclusion of an investigation, not its starting point. He knocked the ash from his pipe and set it aside. We are in the early stages of something that has been in motion for far longer than we realize. Voss did not begin this operation last week or last month. He has been planning it for the better part of a year, studying this building, mapping the underground routes, assembling his resources, and the man behind him has been planning longer still. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. The letter on the mantelpiece, you are holding something that does not belong to you, was not a beginning, Watson. It was a test. He wanted to see if I would react. If I would move the document, alert the police, change my habits. He wanted to measure me. His voice dropped, and in it I heard something I rarely detected. Not fear, but the cold recognition of an adversary worthy of respect. And I rather think he got his measurement. Chapter 4. The tremor beneath. I carried out Holmes's instruction the following morning, with the diligence of a man who understands that his role in such matters is not to deduce but to document. I walked the length of Baker Street twice, once heading south toward the park, and once returning, at a pace slow enough to invite suspicion from any constable who might have been watching. I noted everything. The coal wagon, stationed outside number 189, whose driver dozed on his bench with the practised indifference of a man who had been parked there for hours. The 3 separate sets of roadworks, each attended by labourers in municipal dress who seemed, to my untrained eye, to be doing remarkably little. A hansom cab that stood empty at the corner of Crawford Street for the better part of 40 minutes before departing without a passenger, and a thin, sharp-faced man in a brown ulster, who entered the tobacconist's shop opposite our rooms and did not emerge during the entire duration of my observation. I compiled these notes in my journal and presented them to Holmes over a late breakfast. He read them with the focused attention he might have given a dispatch from the front lines, occasionally pausing to underline a word or mark a passage with his pencil. The roadworks, he said. 3 separate sites, you say, all within 200 yards of this building. Yes, I assumed they were gasworks. The Metropolitan Board has been laying new mains throughout the district, an assumption the perpetrators would be entirely happy for you to make. Tell me, Watson, did you observe the depth of any of the excavations? 1, near the junction with Paddington Street. The trench was perhaps 4 feet deep. I could see the pipe they were working on. It appeared to be a standard gas main. And the others? Boarded over. I could see nothing of what lay beneath. Holmes set down the journal and tapped his pencil against his lower lip, a habit which signified that a connection was forming, though not yet complete. Boarded over, he repeated, which means you could not verify whether any actual work was being performed, or whether the boards themselves were the work. A surface disturbance designed to provide cover for something else entirely. You think the roadworks are connected to the tunnel? I think it would be remarkably convenient, if one were engaged in subterranean excavation, to have multiple legitimate-seeming access points along the surface route, places where earth could be quietly removed, equipment delivered, and the comings and goings of workmen would attract no attention whatsoever. He folded my notes and placed them in the breast pocket of his coat. "I shall investigate the roadworks myself. In the meantime, I have a task for you of a more social character. Mrs. Paris has written again." He handed me a letter that had arrived with the morning post. It was brief and courteous. She reiterated her desire to speak with Holmes, expressed understanding of his preoccupation, and renewed her invitation for me to call at her Kensington address at my convenience. "Go," said Holmes. "Listen, observe, and pay particular attention to what she does not say." Mrs. Paris occupied a set of well-appointed rooms on the second floor of a handsome terrace house in Kensington Church Street. The furnishings were tasteful and spoke of a woman with means, though whether those means were her own or the residue of her long association with Sir Malcolm Cray, I could not immediately determine. She received me in a drawing-room whose walls were lined with bookshelves, and I noticed among the volumes a preponderance of legal texts and financial journals that seemed unusual for a woman of her station. She was, as before, composed and erect. "I appreciate your coming, Dr. Watson. I understand that Mr. Holmes is engaged in a matter of some urgency. I shall not waste your time." She poured tea with the practised efficiency of a woman who had spent years managing the domestic rituals of other people's households, and seated herself opposite me. "Sir Malcolm Cray did not kill himself," she said. "I have known this from the night of his death, and I have spent the month since attempting to gather sufficient evidence to prove it. I believe Mr. Holmes holds the final piece of that evidence, the confession Sir Malcolm wrote in his last days. You know, of the confession? I helped him write it, Doctor. He dictated it to me over 3 evenings in the study of his house in Belgravia. His hands shook too badly to hold a pen, the result, I believe, of the poison that was already working in his system, though we did not know it then." I set down my cup. "You are claiming he was poisoned. I am claiming that the coroner's verdict of self-administered laudanum was convenient, expected, and wrong. Sir Malcolm had no history of laudanum use. He was a man of rigid personal discipline. He did not drink to excess. He did not take opiates, and he had no reason to end his own life. What he had was a confession that, if made public, would destroy one of the most powerful men in England. And who is this man?" She hesitated, not from ignorance, I felt certain, but from a calculated assessment of how much to reveal. "I will share that name with Mr. Holmes, and with Mr. Holmes alone. What I can tell you, Doctor, is that Sir Malcolm was involved in a financial scheme of considerable scale, one that benefited his partner enormously, while exposing Sir Malcolm to all of the legal risk. When Sir Malcolm threatened to go to the authorities, his partner arranged for his silence, permanently." She spoke with the measured precision of a woman who had rehearsed this account many times, perhaps too many times. I found myself recalling Holmes's observation, a secretary's hands, or a forger's. There was nothing in Mrs. Paris's manner that struck me as false, and yet there was a quality of performance in her composure that I could not entirely dismiss. "Why have you not gone to the police?" I asked. "Because the man who killed Sir Malcolm has friends at every level of the Metropolitan Police, the Home Office, and the judiciary. A woman making accusations against a peer of the realm without documentary proof would be destroyed, socially, financially, and perhaps literally. I need that confession, Doctor. It is the only thing that makes the truth undeniable." I thanked her, promised to convey her account to Holmes, and departed. As I descended the stairs to the street, I passed a man ascending, a tall, heavy-set fellow with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent much time outdoors. He wore a workman's coat, which sat oddly on him, as though it were a costume rather than a garment. He glanced at me without interest and continued upward. I thought nothing of it then, but I noted it in my journal that evening. A workman visiting a gentlewoman's drawing-room in Kensington was, at the very least, a minor curiosity. I returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon to find Holmes in an uncharacteristic state of animation. He was on his hands and knees in the centre of the sitting room, his ear pressed to the floorboards, one hand raised for silence. I stopped in the doorway and waited. After a full minute he rose, brushing dust from his knees, and fixed me with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Come here, Watson. Stand exactly where I'm standing." I did so. "Now, close your eyes. Empty your mind of every sound. The clock, the street, the fire. Let them fall away, and tell me what remains." I stood in the silence of the room, feeling faintly foolish, straining to detect whatever it was that had brought Holmes to his knees. The clock ticked. A cab rattled past outside. The fire shifted in the grate. I was about to confess defeat when I felt it. Faint, almost imaginary, a whisper transmitted not through the air but through the soles of my boots and into the bones of my feet. A draught. Not a draught in the conventional sense, not the lateral movement of air from a window or a door, but a vertical exhalation rising from below, carrying with it a cold breath of earth and stone and something else, something mineral and ancient. "I feel it," I said. "Air rising through the floor." "Precisely." Holmes's eyes were alight. "A rising draught, Watson. Air moving upward, through gaps between the floorboards, propelled by pressure differentials created when a new passage connects to an existing air system. The tunnel has breached the underground space directly beneath this building. The air that was trapped below is now finding its way upward, carrying with it the signature of the earth through which the tunnel has been cut." He knelt again and, with a penknife, carefully scraped at the gap between two of the older floorboards near the centre of the room. He collected the residue on a sheet of white paper and carried it to the side table, where his chemical apparatus stood in its usual state of organised chaos. I watched as he examined the sample through his lens, then subjected it to a series of rapid tests, a drop of acid here, a flame there, the careful application of reagents whose names I could not have identified. His movements were swift and sure, the movements of a man who had performed these procedures 1,000 times and needed no conscious thought to guide his hands. "Eitbearing kaolin," he announced, holding the paper to the light. "A clay found at depths of 30 to 40 feet in the London basin. It does not occur naturally at surface level. It does not appear in the sediment of the city's sewers or water mains. It is found only in the deep geological strata, the same strata through which a tunnel would need to pass in order to reach us from the direction of Dorian Lane." He set the paper down and looked at me. "This dust, Watson, has no business being on our floor. It was carried upward by the draught we just detected, air flowing from the tunnel into the substructure of this building and up through the gaps in the floorboards. Our uninvited guests are close, very close." "How close?" "Days, perhaps less." "The draught is recent. I did not detect it yesterday, which means the breach occurred within the last 24 hours. They have entered the space directly beneath us and are now making their final approach." He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed with the intensity of a man weighing variables that only he could see. "The question, Watson, the question that determines everything, is what they intend to do when they arrive. You said they were after the Cray confession. I said I believed so. But belief is not certainty, and in this matter I cannot afford to be wrong. Consider the facts. Someone has invested thousands of pounds, weeks of labour and extraordinary engineering expertise to reach this room from below. That is an investment out of all proportion to the retrieval of a single document, unless that document has the power to destroy an empire." He stopped pacing and faced me. "Mrs. Paris, what did she tell you?" I gave him a complete account of my visit. He listened with his eyes closed, interrupting only once. to ask me to repeat her exact words regarding Sir Malcolm's dictation of the confession. She helped him write it, Holmes said, softly. She was in the room. She knows its contents. He opened his eyes. Which means that if the document alone were the threat, she herself would be equally dangerous to whoever wishes it suppressed. Yet she is alive, Watson. She is unmolested. She moves freely through London and receives visitors in a comfortable drawing room in Kensington. Why? Because they do not know about her, or because they do, and she is not what she appears to be. He left the thought suspended in the air between us, neither affirming nor dismissing it, and turned to a matter of more immediate practicality. The roadworks, he said. I examined 2 of the 3 sites this afternoon. The first is genuine, a gas main repair, properly documented with the Board of Works. The second is not. The trench has been dug to a depth consistent with a vertical access shaft, and the earth removed from it bears the same kaolin signature as the dust on our floor. It is, in effect, a ventilation and extraction point for the tunnel, hidden in plain sight beneath the apparatus of municipal improvement. And the men working it? Not Board of Works employees. I checked the municipal register. No permits have been issued for that section of the street. The barriers, the signage, the workman's dress, all fabricated. It is a remarkably thorough deception, Watson. Whoever designed this operation understands that the best camouflage is not invisibility, but normalcy. A man digging a hole in the street at night attracts attention. A man digging a hole in the street in broad daylight, wearing a municipal vest and surrounded by official-looking barriers, is invisible. He moved to the window and looked out at Baker Street, now quiet in the gathering dusk. They are beneath us, Watson. Right now. Beneath the street, beneath the foundations, beneath the floor on which we stand. And they are almost through. He drew the curtains and turned back to the room, his expression shifting from analysis to resolve. Tomorrow I shall pay a visit to the records of the Royal Engineers and confirm what I already suspect about Mr. Voss's capabilities. And then, Watson, we shall begin to prepare. Prepare for what? He smiled. That thin, dangerous smile I had seen at the window of the public house on Dorian Lane. For their arrival. Chapter 5. Dust from the deep homes disappeared for the entirety of the following day. This was not in itself unusual, but the manner of his departure unsettled me. He had risen before dawn. I heard him moving about the sitting room at an hour when even the milkmen had not yet begun their rounds, and when I descended at 7:30, I found only a brief note on the breakfast table, written in his rapid, angular hand. Gone to confirm a theory. Do not wait, do not follow. If a man calls identifying himself as Porlock, admit him and write down every word he says. No man called Porlock appeared that day. I spent the morning at my practice, the afternoon reviewing my notes on the case, and the evening in an increasingly anxious vigil by the fire. It was nearly 11 o'clock when I heard the front door open and the familiar tread on the stairs, but slower than usual, heavier, as though Holmes were carrying something of considerable weight. He entered the sitting room in a state I had rarely seen. His face was drawn, his eyes ringed with shadow, and his clothes, a rough labourer's jacket and corduroy trousers I did not recognise, were coated from collar to boot in a fine pale dust that caught the firelight and gave him the appearance of a man who had clawed his way out of a grave. He said nothing. He crossed directly to the chemical table, set down a canvas satchel that clinked faintly with the sound of glass on glass, and began to work. I watched in silence as he unpacked the satchel. It contained a dozen small glass vials, each sealed with wax, each labelled in Holmes's hand with notations I could not decipher, strings of numbers and abbreviations that belonged, I assumed, to some private system of cataloguing. He arranged them in a precise row lit the spirit lamp, and began his analysis. For the next 2 hours I sat and observed as Sherlock Holmes performed what I can only describe as an archaeological excavation conducted entirely through chemistry. Each vial contained a sample of earth. Clay, ite mixed with ite, extracted, I gathered, from different points along the tunnel's route. He tested each with the methodical passion of a man who has found at last the physical proof of a theory long suspected. He did not speak until he had finished. Then he sat back, removed his magnifying lens, and looked at me with an expression I'd seen only a handful of times in our long association, an expression of pure, undisguised exhilaration. "Watson," he said, "I have been inside the tunnel." Good God. I entered through the ventilation shaft on Baker Street. The false roadworks we identified. The opening is concealed beneath a hinged steel plate, disguised as a drain cover. From there, a vertical ladder descends approximately 35 feet to the main passage. The tunnel itself runs northwest, precisely as the old maintenance passage indicated, but it has been extended, expertly, Watson, with a skill that borders on artistry. He held up one of the vials. This is from the tunnel face, the point of active excavation. Kaolin clay, as I suspected, but mixed with a stratum of phaetondite that places the depth at no less than 40 feet. At that level, we are well below the sewers, below the gas mains, below every layer of modern London. We are in the geological past, the clay beds laid down 60 million years ago. And the tunnel is aimed at this building. It is aimed at this room. I measured the bearing using a pocket compass and the angle of the passage. The trajectory is precise, not approximate, not general, but calculated to within inches. Whoever surveyed this route did so with instruments of professional quality. The passage terminates at a face of packed earth approximately 12 feet from the northwest corner of our sitting room, directly beneath the area where the dispatch box stands. He pointed to the floor, and I found myself staring at the worn boards as though I might see through them to the darkness below. 12 feet, I repeated. Then they are 2 days' work, perhaps 3, depending on the density of the remaining earth and whether they encounter any obstruction. The shoring is immaculate, squared timbers tightly fitted, no gaps. The ventilation is managed through a series of canvas tubes connected to a hand-operated bellows at the Dorian Lane end. There is even a system of muffled rails for removing excavated earth without the sound of dragging. He shook his head slowly, and I saw in his expression something that went beyond professional admiration, a genuine, almost reluctant respect. This is not the work of a desperate man, Watson. This is the work of a brilliant one. Edgar Voss has designed an operation that would stand comparison with the siege works at Sebastopol. Every contingency has been anticipated. Every sound has been accounted for. The tools are custom made. I found markings consistent with a specialist manufacturer in Sheffield, a firm that supplies mining and tunnelling equipment to order. The cost of this operation, in materials alone, would exceed £2,000. Then the man behind it is wealthy beyond the means of any dismissed military officer. Yes, the financial chain points upward, Watson, always upward. Voss is the hand, but the mind, the money, the motive, these belong to someone else. He rose and went to the basin, where he began the lengthy process of removing the pale dust from his hands and face. I watched the water turn grey, then white, as the kaolin clay dissolved. "There is something else," he said, his back to me. "Something I did not expect." "What?" "The tunnel is not designed for a single entry. The shoring, the ventilation, the rail system, these are not temporary measures. They are built to last. Whoever commissioned this passage intends for it to be used more than once." He turned, drying his hands on a towel. "Consider what that means, Watson. A single retrieval operation. Enter, take the document, leave, could be accomplished with far cruder methods. A narrow shaft, a brief intrusion, a hasty retreat. Instead, we have a permanent infrastructure, a passage that can be entered and exited at will, silently, without detection, for as long as the building above it stands. A permanent means of access to 221B Baker Street. To whatever 221B Baker Street contains. Today it is a confession. Tomorrow it may be a different document, a different secret. The tunnel is not a tool for one crime, Watson. It is a tool for continuous surveillance, a private entrance to the consulting, detective's archive, available whenever the need arises. The implications of this settled over me with a weight that was almost physical. It was not merely the confession they wanted. It was Holmes himself, or rather, everything Holmes knew, every secret entrusted to him, every piece of evidence that had passed through his hands over a decade of practice. Then Voss is not simply a thief, I said. Voss is an instrument, a superb instrument, wielded by a man who thinks in terms not of crimes, but of campaigns. This is strategic, Watson. Long-term, patient, the kind of thinking one encounters not in the criminal underworld, but in the corridors of power, in the clubs and committee rooms where men decide the fate of nations over port and cigars. He sat down heavily in his chair, and for the first time I noticed that the exhilaration had given way to something darker, a gravity in his expression that I associated with cases where the stakes had risen beyond the merely criminal. I'm going to tell you something, Watson, that I have not previously shared. When I read Sir Malcolm Creye's confession 3 weeks ago, I was struck by a name that appeared not in the body of the text, but in a marginal notation, added in a different hand. The notation read, H authorised all transfers. See Ledger C, entries 14 through 31. H? An initial. Nothing more. But it was written in ink of a different age than the confession itself, added later, perhaps by Sir Malcolm, perhaps by someone else. I did not pursue it at the time, because the confession itself seemed straightforward. Sir Malcolm described his involvement in a financial fraud, named his co-conspirator, and expressed his intention to surrender himself to the authorities. And now? Now, I believe the initial refers to a man whose involvement Sir Malcolm was afraid to state explicitly, even in a document intended as a full confession. A man so powerful that even from beyond the grave, Sir Malcolm could not bring himself to write his name. Holmes reached for his pipe, but did not fill it. He held it in his hands, turning it slowly, his gaze fixed on some interior landscape I could not see. I have been investigating the financial affairs of several prominent individuals over the past week. The records are fragmentary, deliberately so, but a pattern is emerging. Large sums move through intermediary accounts, property transactions designed to obscure ownership, charitable foundations used as conduits for funds that were anything but charitable, and at the centre of it all, appearing and disappearing like a figure in fog, is a man who sits in the House of Lords, who dines with cabinet ministers, and who has never, in 30 years of public life, been touched by scandal. Who? Holmes looked at me. His grey eyes were calm, but beneath the calm I saw something I could not quite identify. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness of the terrain into which we were moving. Lord Arthur Halberton. The name meant something to me, though I could not immediately place it. Halberton. I'd seen it in the papers. A parliamentary figure, a member of several influential committees, a patron of the arts, a man of unimpeachable reputation. You're certain? I am not yet certain of anything, Watson. Certainty is the destination. We are still en route, but the financial trail, the military connection to Voss, and the initial in Sir Malcolm's confession all converge on the same point. Halberton had the motive. The confession destroys him. He had the means. His fortune is enormous and largely invisible, and he had the opportunity. His connections within the military establishment would have given him access to a man like Voss. He set the pipe down on the arm of the chair. But I need more. A name whispered in a sitting room is not evidence. To bring down a man of Halberton's position, I need proof that would survive the scrutiny of the most hostile courtroom in England. And that proof, Watson, may be coming to us, carried in the hands of a man who does not yet know he is delivering it. Voss. Voss, who is at this moment 12 feet below our floor, labouring in silence, believing himself entirely undetected. He is coming for the confession. He intends to replace it with a forgery and withdraw without trace. And when he does... Holmes's voice dropped to a murmur, and the firelight caught the edge of his smile. He will find that I have prepared a welcome he did not anticipate. I did not sleep well that night. The knowledge of what lay beneath us, the dark passage, the silent work, the patient approach of hands guided by a mind we had not yet fully measured, pressed upon me with a weight that no amount of rational reassurance could lift. I lay in my bed and listened to the house, and every creak, every settling of timber, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry within it the faint rhythmic pulse of excavation. At some point in the small hours I rose and went to the window. Baker Street lay silent below, shrouded in fog. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, and yet, somewhere beneath that still surface, the earth was being opened, inch by men who would not stop until they had reached us. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Map. The morning of November the 8th brought with it a development I had not anticipated, not from the tunnel, nor from the shadowy figure of Lord Halberton, but from the trembling hand of a young solicitor's clerk named Alistair Crewe. He arrived at Baker Street shortly after 9 o'clock, without appointment, and in a state of agitation so pronounced that Mrs. Hudson took the unusual step of interrupting Holmes's breakfast to announce him. Holmes, who had spent the previous evening in deep consultation with a set of geological surveys borrowed from the Royal School of Mines, looked up from his toast with the expression of a man whose solitude has been violated, then, hearing the name, set down his knife and gestured for the visitor to be admitted. Crewe entered the sitting-room as though crossing the threshold of a church in which he did not entirely believe. He was, as I had described to Holmes, a slight young man with fair hair and anxious blue eyes that moved constantly, cataloguing the room's contents with the involuntary thoroughness of a person who has been taught to notice details, but not yet taught to conceal that he is noticing them. "Mr. Crewe," said Holmes, indicating the chair opposite. "Please sit. Watson, close the door." I did so, and took my own seat, notebook in hand. Crewe perched on the edge of the chair as though prepared to flee at the first sign of danger. His hands, I noticed, were clenched in his lap, the knuckles white. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I must apologize for calling without notice. I came last week to inquire about certain documents in your custody, on behalf of the firm, you understand, and Dr. Watson was kind enough to receive me, but that is not why I'm here today." "I rather thought not," said Holmes. "You have come because you are frightened, Mr. Crewe, and because the thing that frightens you has grown beyond your capacity to manage alone. Please, tell us what you know. Begin at the beginning, and omit nothing." The effect of these words on the young man was remarkable. The tension did not leave his body, but it shifted, reorganized itself into something closer to resolve. He drew a breath and spoke. "I am a junior clerk at Hartwell, Stamp and Prescott, the firm that handled Sir Malcolm Crewe's estate. My duties are largely administrative, filing, copying, maintaining the document register. It was in this capacity that I first became aware of the confession. You have read it?" "No, sir, I have not. But I know of its existence because I was tasked with recording its transfer to your custody. The entry in the register reads, 'One sealed document, contents, unspecified, transferred to S. Holmes, 221B Baker Street, per instruction of executor, 9th October 1895. I made that entry myself. And, Crewe's hands tightened further. 3 days after the transfer, I was called into the office of Mr. Hartwell, the senior partner. He asked me to produce the register entry. I did so. He read it, said nothing, and dismissed me. The following morning, the entry had been removed. The page on which I had written it had been cut from the register with a razor and replaced with a blank sheet. When I inquired, I was told the entry had been made in error and that no such transfer had taken place. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And you did not believe this explanation? I could not, sir. I had made the entry with my own hand. I had witnessed the executor sign the receipt. The transfer was real. Someone had erased it, deliberately, thoroughly, and expected me to accept the erasure without question. But you did not. I did not. I began, quietly you, understand, and at considerable risk to my position, to investigate. I examined the firm's financial records for the Cray estate and discovered a series of payments that did not correspond to any services rendered. Large sums, hundreds of pounds, paid to a company I had never heard of. Blackwall Engineering Associates. At the mention of this name, Holmes's posture changed. It was a subtle shift, a straightening of the spine, a slight forward inclination. But I knew it well. It was the posture of a hound that has caught a scent. Continue, he said. I could find no record of Blackwall Engineering Associates in the commercial registers. No office, no directors, no filings of any kind. The payments were authorised by Mr. Hartwell personally, using discretionary funds from the estate account. I copied the relevant entries and kept them. He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper, which he handed to Holmes. Holmes unfolded it, studied it for perhaps 30 seconds, and set it down on the table with a care that bordered on reverence. "Mr. Crewe," he said, "do you understand what you have brought me?" "I believe I've brought you evidence of fraud, sir. You have brought me rather more than that. Blackwall Engineering Associates is the name under which the lease for 14 Dorian Lane was secured 3 months ago. It is also the name through which a substantial order of specialised tunnelling equipment was placed with a manufacturer in Sheffield. Silent excavation tools, timber shoring, canvas ventilation ducting, equipment designed for one purpose and one purpose only." Crewe stared at him. "Tunnelling equipment? The payments you have identified, Mr. Crewe, are the financial backbone of an operation that has been months in the planning, an operation designed to penetrate this building from below and retrieve the very document whose existence your employer attempted to erase from the record." The colour drained from the young man's face with such rapidity that I half rose from my chair, fearing he might faint. He did not, but his voice, when he spoke, had lost its fragile steadiness. "Mr. Holmes, there is more. Last Thursday evening, I was working late at the office. I was alone, or believed myself to be. I heard voices from Mr. Hartwell's private room. The door was closed, but the walls of our offices are thin, and I could hear clearly enough. What did you hear? 2 men speaking. One was Mr. Hartwell. The other I did not recognize, a deep voice, authoritative, accustomed to command. They were discussing the confession. The unknown man was angry. He said, and I remember his exact words, the document should never have left the estate. Your incompetence has created a problem that now requires extraordinary measures to resolve. And Hartwell's response? He was apologetic, obsequious even. He said he had not anticipated that the executor would act independently and that the matter was being addressed. The other man said, "It had better be. I will not have my name attached to this, Hartwell. Not now, not ever. See that it is done, or I shall find someone who can." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you see the second man? Even a glimpse?" As he left, I was in the corridor, pressed against the wall. He passed within 3 feet of me. Tall, broad-shouldered silver hair, a heavy coat with a fur collar. He carried himself like a man who owned the building, owned the street, owned everything. I'd never seen him before, but I knew Mr. Holmes. I knew that I was looking at the man behind all of it. Holmes glanced at me, and in that glance I read a confirmation that required no words. The description matched what we had gathered of Lord Arthur Halberton. The bearing, the authority, the expectation of absolute compliance. "Mr. Crewe," said Holmes, "you have done a brave thing in coming here. I want you to understand the gravity of your position. The men involved in this affair are powerful, resourceful, and entirely willing to remove obstacles. You are, at this moment, an obstacle. I know, sir. That is why I came. You will not return to your office. Not today, not tomorrow. I shall arrange for you to stay at a safe location until this matter is resolved. Watson, you will see to it." I nodded. "One more thing, Mr. Crewe. The financial records you copied, are there any other documents at the firm that might connect Hartwell to the tunnel operation? Maps, correspondence, engineering plans?" Crewe hesitated. "There is one thing. In Hartwell's private office, in a locked drawer to which only he has the key, there is a map. I saw it once, briefly, when he left the drawer open during a meeting. It was old, hand-drawn on heavy paper, and it showed a network of passages beneath the streets surrounding Baker Street. Some of the passages were marked in red ink with measurements and annotations. I assumed it was related to a property matter, but now you understand what it represents." "Yes, sir." Holmes stood and crossed to the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the street below, his hands clasped behind his back. "A forgotten map," he murmured. "Drawn by whom, I wonder? The original engineers, or someone who came after, someone who studied the underground routes and saw in them not infrastructure but opportunity?" He turned back to the room. "Mr. Crewe, you mentioned that the tools were ordered through Blackwall Engineering. This confirms something I had suspected but could not prove, that the operation required significant funding, not hundreds but thousands of pounds, channeled through a shell company to avoid detection. The financial chain now runs from the Cray estate through Hartwell's firm to the tunnel itself. And above it all," he paused, and his voice hardened, "above it all sits a man who believes his position renders him untouchable. A man who has spent decades constructing a fortress of reputation and influence, and who will destroy anyone who threatens it." He looked at Crewe with an expression that was, for Holmes, unusually gentle. "You have threatened it, Mr. Crewe. By copying those records, by coming here, by refusing to accept the erasure of the truth, you have placed yourself in opposition to a man who does not tolerate opposition. I will not minimize that danger, but I will tell you this. You have given me two things I did not have before, the financial trail and the confirmation that Hartwell is complicit. These are not trivial gifts." He extended his hand, and the young man shook it with a grip that trembled but did not falter. After Crewe had been dispatched, in a cab, under instructions to proceed directly to a lodging-house in Bloomsbury where Holmes maintained a discreet arrangement for the protection of vulnerable witnesses, Holmes sat for a long time in silence, studying the financial records Crewe had provided. "The structural shift," he said at last, almost to himself. "I beg your pardon?" "The chair, Watson. Your chair. You noticed some days ago that it sat unevenly, a tilt you attributed to imagination. I noticed it too. At first I thought the same, but this morning, before Crewe arrived, I measured the sitting-room floor with a spirit level." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small brass instrument. "The floor has shifted by less than a quarter of an inch, imperceptible to the eye, barely detectable by feel, but measurable. The northwest corner of this room has subsided fractionally, consistent with the removal of earth from beneath the foundations." He set the spirit level on the table. The tunnel is not merely approaching this building, Watson. It is affecting it. The room itself is changing, tilting, settling, adjusting to the void that is being carved beneath it. And they do not know that I have noticed. They believe their work is invisible. He picked up Crew's financial records and locked them in the dispatch box alongside Sir Malcolm's confession. We now have the who, the how, and the why. We know the target. We know the route. We know the funding, the personnel, and the timeline. What we do not yet have is the moment, the precise hour at which they will make their move. He turned to me, and I saw in his face the cold, focused clarity of a man who has assembled every piece of a puzzle save the last. But that, Watson, is coming, and when it does, we must be ready. Chapter 7. The Board. That shifted 2 days past in a state of suspended tension that I can only compare to the hours before a military engagement. That peculiar stillness in which every man knows what is coming, but cannot yet see it, and the waiting itself becomes a kind of torment. Holmes had become, if possible, even more secretive than before. He spent long hours at his desk, working through calculations I could not follow, page after page of figures, measurements, angles, and timing estimates that he covered with his arm whenever I approached. Not from mistrust, but from an instinct for compartmentalization that I had long since learned to accept. He ate little. He slept, as far as I could determine, not at all. And each night, after the house had fallen silent, he would take up his position in the darkened sitting room and listen to the tremors beneath the floor, which had grown over the preceding 48 hours perceptibly stronger. I felt them now without effort. The rhythmic pulse had acquired a new quality, a nearness, a proximity that transformed what had been an abstract vibration into something almost intimate. It was as though the earth beneath us had developed a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was drawing closer with every hour. On the evening of November the 10th, Holmes broke his silence. "Watson," he said, looking up from his calculations with the abruptness of a man surfacing from deep water, "I need you to do something for me. Something that will require a steady hand and an absolute commitment to doing precisely as I say. You have both." "Good. Tonight, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, I intend to conduct an experiment. I'm going to open the floor." I stared at him. "Open the floor?" "A single board. The one nearest the dispatch box, the board beneath which I detected the strongest draft and the highest concentration of kaolin dust. I intend to lift it and examine what lies beneath. Is that not precisely what they intend to do from the other side? It is, which is why I must do it first. I need to know the exact distance remaining between their excavation and our floor. I need to know the composition of the intervening material, whether it is packed earth, rubble, or original brickwork, and I need to know whether they have already made a test entry." "A test entry?" Holmes rose and led me to the centre of the room. He knelt beside the dispatch box and pointed to a specific floorboard, the third from the wall, an old plank of English oak that had darkened with age to the colour of strong tea. "Look at the edge," he said, "here, where the board meets its neighbour." I knelt beside him and looked. At first I saw nothing. Then, as Holmes directed the beam of a small electric torch along the joint, I saw it. A scratch. Faint, precise, running the full length of the board's edge, not the random scoring of furniture legs or boot heels, but a single, deliberate line, as though something thin and flat had been inserted into the gap from below and drawn along the wood. "A blade?" I said. "A very fine blade, inserted from beneath to test whether the board could be lifted without resistance. The scratch is recent, the exposed wood is pale, unoxidized. This was done within the last 48 hours. They have already been here, not here, beneath here, They have reached the underside of our floor and conducted a preliminary assessment. They tested the board, confirmed it could be moved, and withdrew. The full operation, the entry, the replacement of the document, has not yet occurred. But it will. Soon. He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. Tonight, I test the board from above. I need to understand what they will encounter when they come through, and more importantly, I need to understand the space beneath it. If there is a cavity between the floor and the tunnel ceiling, it will tell me how they intend to operate. If the space is narrow, they will send one man. If it is wider, they may send two. At 2:30, with the house in absolute darkness and the street outside reduced to silence by a thick November fog, Holmes and I knelt on either side of the marked floorboard. Holmes had assembled a small collection of tools, a thin pry bar wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, a hand mirror, the electric torch, and a folding ruler. He worked with the deliberate slowness of a man diffusing an explosive, easing the pry bar into the gap and applying pressure in minute increments. The board resisted, then yielded, rising 1/4 of an inch with a faint groan that, in the silence, seemed as loud as a gunshot. Holmes paused. We waited. Nothing stirred. He continued, lifting the board another inch, then 2, until it could be tilted aside and laid on the rug. Beneath it was darkness. Holmes directed the torch downward. The beam revealed first the expected joists, heavy timbers, blackened with age, and between them a space of perhaps 18 inches before the original brickwork of the building's foundation began. But the brickwork was not intact. A section, roughly 2 feet square, had been carefully removed and replaced with packed earth, the same pale, kaolin-rich clay I had seen in Holmes's laboratory samples. And in the centre of that packed earth, visible even in the narrow beam of the torch, was a depression, a shallow concavity, as though something had pressed against it from below. "They are directly beneath us," Holmes whispered. "The tunnel ceiling is inches from our foundation. The packed earth you see is their work. They have filled the gap between their excavation and our floor to prevent premature collapse. When they are ready, they will remove this fill, lift the board from below, and enter the room." He angled the hand mirror into the space and studied the reflection for a long time, adjusting the torch to illuminate different sections. The fill is recent, damp, applied within the last day. And here, he pointed to the edge of the depression, tool marks, the same fine blade that scored our floorboard. He tested the entry point, confirmed the distance, and withdrew. One man. The space would accommodate one man only, on his back, working upward. He would need to be lean, strong, and accustomed to confined spaces. A man with engineering training and nerves of uncommon quality. Voss. Almost certainly Voss himself. This is not a task he would delegate. The final entry is the most critical phase of the entire operation. One miscalculation, one sound, one moment of clumsiness, and the entire enterprise collapses. He will do it himself. Holmes replaced the board with the same excruciating care with which he had removed it, pressing it back into its seating until it was flush with its neighbours. Then he took a pinch of dust from a small envelope and distributed it along the board's edges, a private seal that would reveal any subsequent disturbance. We withdrew to the far side of the room, and Holmes lit a single candle. "I know now what I need to know," he said. "The distance, the method, the point of entry. What I do not yet know, and what determines everything, is when. Can you not simply wait, monitor the floor each night until they come? I could. But that assumes I am the only variable in this equation, and I am not. There are forces at work above ground that may accelerate the timetable. Halberton is not a patient man. Ah, the conversation Crewe overheard makes that clear. He wants the confession destroyed before it can reach official hands, and every day it remains in my possession increases the risk that I will act upon it. He will be pressing Voss to move quickly. He paused, and a thought seemed to cross his mind, a shadow that briefly darkened his expression before being mastered. There is another consideration, Watson, one that troubles me. What is it? They are coming for something, but whether they know what they seek is another matter entirely. I frowned. You said yourself they want the Cray confession. I believe they do. But consider, what if Voss has not been told the full truth? What if Halberton has described the document in general terms, a dangerous paper, a threat to be neutralized, without revealing its specific contents? In that case, Voss would enter this room knowing he must find and replace a document, but not knowing precisely what it says. Why would that matter? Because a man who does not know what he is stealing cannot fully appreciate its value, and a man who does not appreciate the value of what he holds is a man who might be persuaded, under the right circumstances, to become something other than a thief. He let the thought hang in the air, unfinished, and I understood that he was not yet ready to share its full implications. There is one more thing I must verify, he said. Tomorrow I shall pay a visit to a certain dealer in specialist tools, a man in Clerkenwell who supplies equipment to the mining and engineering trades. If my theory is correct, Voss purchased his excavation tools through this dealer, and the dealer will be able to confirm the specifications. And if he confirms them, then I shall know the precise capabilities of the tools Voss is using, their cutting speed, their noise profile, their limitations. And from that, Watson, I can calculate the remaining time with considerable accuracy. He extinguished the candle. Go to bed, Watson. Sleep if you can. The next few days will require us both at our sharpest. I did not sleep. I lay in the darkness and listened, not to the tremors which had ceased for the night, but to the silence itself, which had acquired a texture I had never previously noticed. It was the silence of a room that was no longer entirely solid, a room whose floor had been tested from below by hands we had not seen, whose foundations were being quietly consumed by a passage we could not stop. And somewhere in that silence I heard, or imagined I heard, the faintest sound, so subtle it might have been the movement of air through a crack no wider than a hair, a slow, steady breathing rising from the earth beneath us like the exhalation of something vast and patient and very, very close. The following morning, Holmes departed for Clerkenwell. He returned in the early afternoon with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which he set on the desk, without explanation, and a look of quiet satisfaction that told me his enquiries had been productive. The dealer remembers the order, he said. Custom specifications, silent cutting blades with rubber-dampened handles, a miniature hydraulic jack designed to apply upward pressure without percussive impact, and, this is the detail that confirms everything, a set of precision measuring rods, calibrated to the inch, of the type used in military sapping operations to calculate the exact distance between a tunnel face and a target surface. He unwrapped the parcel. Inside was a single tool, a slender steel rod, perhaps 18 inches long, with graduated markings along its length, and a padded tip designed to be pressed against a surface without making a sound. The dealer had one remaining from the same batch. I purchased it for comparison. The markings correspond to the measurements I observed in the tunnel. The same calibration system, the same manufacturer's stamp. Voss ordered these tools specifically for this operation, and they were delivered to the Dorian Lane address 6 weeks ago. He set the rod on the desk beside the financial records, the geological samples, and the engineering schematics, the accumulated evidence of an investigation that had grown, piece by piece, into a comprehensive portrait of a conspiracy. We have everything, Watson. The route, the method, the funding, the personnel, the tools, and the target. Everything except the hour. He looked toward the floor, toward the board we had lifted in the darkness, now indistinguishable from its fellows. But the hour will choose itself, and when it does, we must be ready to answer it. 1811, Chapter 8, The Night Holmes waited. It was on the evening of November the 12th that Holmes revealed his plan, and it was, I confess, the first time in our long association that I considered the possibility that my friend had miscalculated. We had dined in silence, or rather, I had dined while Holmes rearranged the food on his plate with the abstracted indifference of a man whose appetite had been entirely consumed by thought. Mrs. Hudson had cleared the table and retired for the night. The fire had burned low. Outside, a thin rain was falling, glazing the windows of the sitting room with a shifting membrane of light and shadow that made the familiar room seem strange, uncertain, provisional. Holmes rose from the table and crossed to the dispatch box. He unlocked it, withdrew Sir Malcolm Creye's confession, and laid it on the desk beneath the lamp. It was, I saw now for the first time in its entirety, a document of some dozen pages, closely written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady as it progressed, the letters trembling and listing to one side as though the writer's strength had been failing even as his pen moved across the paper. "I want you to read it, Watson," Holmes said. "All of it, tonight." I took up the pages and read. It took me the better part of an hour, and when I'd finished, I understood, fully, viscerally, why someone would dig through 40 feet of London clay to make it disappear. Sir Malcolm Creye's confession was not merely an admission of fraud. It was a detailed, methodical account of a criminal enterprise spanning nearly 2 decades. A system of financial manipulation, political coercion, and calculated intimidation orchestrated by a man Sir Malcolm referred to throughout as my patron. The patron had identified vulnerable men in positions of influence, parliamentarians, judges, senior civil servants, and had drawn them one by one into a web of compromising obligations, loans that could never be repaid, investments that concealed bribes, charitable endowments that were, in truth, instruments of control. Sir Malcolm had been among the first recruits. A younger son with expensive habits and insufficient income, he had been offered financial rescue in exchange for cooperation, and had discovered too late that cooperation was merely another word for servitude. For 16 years he had managed the patron's financial architecture, moving money through a labyrinth of accounts and intermediaries, always aware that the evidence of his own complicity made escape impossible, until, at last, the weight had become unbearable. The confession was his attempt to break free, to place the truth beyond the reach of the man who had enslaved him, in the hands of someone who could not be bought or intimidated. The marginal notation Holmes had mentioned was there, on the 7th page. H authorized all transfers. See Ledger C, entries 14 through 31. The handwriting was different from the body of the text, steadier, more deliberate, as though added at a later date by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. I set the pages down and looked at Holmes. This would destroy Halberton. It would destroy a great deal more than Halberton. The men named in this document, implicitly through the transactions described, include 2 sitting members of Parliament, a High Court judge, and the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. This is not a confession, Watson. It is a bomb, and we are sitting on top of it. He took the document from the desk and held it in both hands, studying it as though weighing not its physical mass but its capacity for destruction. "Tomorrow night," he said. "That is when they will come." "How can you know that?" "The dust seal I placed on the floorboard was disturbed this morning. Not broken, tested. Someone pressed against the board from below, just enough to shift the dust at the edges, then withdrew. It was a final reconnaissance, the last check before the operation begins, and the tremors have stopped. I had noticed this. The rhythmic pulse that had become, over the past week, a constant companion to our evenings, had ceased sometime during the previous night. The silence had been paradoxically more alarming than the vibration. "The digging is complete," Holmes continued. "The tunnel is finished. The fill beneath our floor is the last barrier, and it can be removed in minutes. They are waiting for the optimal moment, a night when the street is quiet, the household asleep, and the risk of detection at its lowest. Tomorrow is a Wednesday. Mrs. Hudson visits her sister on Wednesday evenings and does not return until Thursday morning. The street market on the Marylebone Road will have ended, reducing foot traffic, and the weather forecast calls for fog." He set the confession down. "They will come tomorrow night. I am certain of it. Then we alert the police. Lestrade would station 6 constables on Baker Street with the subtlety of a brass band. Voss would detect them within minutes, abort the operation, and vanish. The tunnel would be sealed, the Dorian Lane property abandoned, and we would be left with nothing but a hole in the ground and a collection of circumstantial evidence that no court would accept against a peer of the realm. Then what do you propose?" Holmes sat down opposite me and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his grey eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that left no room for evasion. "I propose to let them in." The silence that followed was, I believe, the longest of our friendship. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious. I intend to let Voss enter this room, locate the confession, and attempt to replace it with his forgery. And then, at the precise moment when the substitution is in progress, I intend to spring the trap. And if the trap fails, if Voss is armed, if there are more men than we expect, Voss will not be armed. A weapon in a confined space is a liability, not an advantage. Any man with military training knows this. And the tunnel will accommodate only one man at the entry point. His crew will be stationed further back, at the Dorian Lane end, managing the ventilation. And the retreat route, he will be alone when he enters this room. You are staking everything on that assumption. I'm staking everything on my knowledge of the man. Voss is a perfectionist. He has designed this operation to be silent, invisible, and complete. He will not compromise it with additional personnel at the critical point. The entry is his skill, his risk, his moment. He will come alone. I rose from my chair and paced the room, a habit I had acquired from Holmes himself, though I employed it with considerably less grace. "And what of the confession? If you allow Voss to take it, he will not take it. He will take what he believes to be the confession." Holmes went to the desk and opened a drawer I had not previously seen him use. From it he withdrew a second document, identical in appearance to the first. The same paper, the same ink, the same trembling hand. I took it and compared the two side by side. The forgery, for that was what it was masterful. Every line, every blot, every hesitation of the pen had been reproduced with a fidelity that made my skin crawl. "When did you—" "Over the past 3 nights. I have some small talent for imitation, as you know, but this is not the original, Watson. This is what Voss will find in the dispatch box when he enters. The original—" He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a slender oilskin packet, no larger than a letter. "The original will be on my person. It has not left my person since yesterday morning, and it will not leave my person until this matter is concluded. You are creating a double substitution. Voss comes to replace the confession with his forgery, but the confession he finds is already your forgery. He takes your forgery, leaves his own, and departs believing the operation was successful, while I retain the original and gain in addition a sample of Halberton's forgery, which can be analysed, traced, and used as evidence of the conspiracy. It was, I had to admit, elegant, But elegance, in my experience, was a poor substitute for certainty, and there were too many variables, too many moments where the machinery could jam, where the unexpected could intrude and shatter the careful geometry of Holmes's design. "There is a risk you have not addressed," I said. "What if Voss reads the document, not merely takes it, but examines it, compares it to his forgery, checks for discrepancies? Your imitation is superb, but if he has been given a detailed description of the original, then he will find discrepancies. Subtle ones, deliberate ones. I've introduced 3 minor variations, a date transposed, a name slightly misspelled, and the marginal notation moved from the 7th page to the 8th. If Voss notices these, he will conclude that his information was imperfect, not that the document has been switched. It is a calculated risk, Watson. I will not pretend otherwise." He stood and placed both documents on the desk, the original in its oilskin, the substitute in the dispatch box. But there is a greater risk in doing nothing. Every day the confession remains in this room, Halberton grows more desperate. If the tunnel fails, he will try other means, bribery, burglary, arson. He will not stop. The only way to end this is to let the operation proceed, capture Voss in the act, and use the evidence to bring the full weight of the law down upon Halberton before he can mount a defence. And Voss himself? You said he might be turned, that a man who does not know the value of what he holds might become something other than a thief. Holmes's expression shifted, a flicker of something I could not read, there and gone. "That is my hope, but it is not my plan. My plan assumes Voss is loyal to Halberton and will resist capture. If he can be turned, so much the better. If not, the physical evidence will suffice." He crossed to the window and looked out at the rain. "I have sent word to Lestrade, not to station men on the street, but to have a team ready at Paddington Green within 5 minutes' ride of Baker Street, prepared to move on my signal. The signal will be a lamp in the window, 3 flashes. You will give the signal, Watson, at the moment I say, and not before." "And what will you be doing?" "I will be in this room, in the dark, waiting." There was a finality in his voice that foreclosed further argument. I knew Holmes well enough to understand that the plan was set, that he had weighed every variable, accepted every risk, and committed himself to a course of action from which he would not be diverted. But I also knew, and this knowledge sat in my chest like a cold stone, that Holmes was not infallible, that his confidence, though rooted in extraordinary ability, was still the confidence of a single man pitting himself against an adversary he had described in unguarded moments with genuine respect. That Voss was not a common criminal to be outmanoeuvred by superior intellect alone, but a man of discipline, perception, and resource, a man who had built a tunnel beneath London with the precision of a military campaign, and who would not, I feared, be easily surprised. "Holmes," I said, and he turned from the window to face me. "If you are wrong about this, if something goes awry, what then?" He held my gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I had rarely seen, not doubt, but the honest acknowledgement of its possibility. "If I am wrong, Watson," he said quietly, "then tonight we lose everything." He let the words stand. Then with the ghost of a smile, "But I do not intend to be wrong." He moved to his chair and sat down, folding his long frame into the posture I knew so well. The steepled fingers, the closed eyes, the absolute stillness of a mind that had done all it could do, and now waited for the world to confirm or deny its calculations. "Tomorrow night, Watson. Everything begins and ends tomorrow night." I retired to my bedroom but did not undress. I sat on the edge of my bed, my old service revolver on the nightstand beside me, and watched the rain trace silver lines down the window pane. Somewhere beneath the street, in a passage no wider than a man's shoulders, Edgar Voss was making his own preparations, checking his tools, reviewing his route, steeling himself for the operation that would define the success or failure of months of meticulous planning. 2 men, 2 plans, 1 room, and between them a single sheet of floor, thinner, I now knew, than either of us might have wished. Chapter 9. The Perfect Replacement. The fog came as Holmes had predicted. Thick, sulphurous, absolute. By 9 o'clock on the evening of November the 13th, Baker Street had been reduced to a corridor of smothered light, the gas lamps no more than faint amber smears in a darkness that seemed to have substance and weight. Mrs. Hudson had departed for her sister's at 6:30, and the house had settled into a silence so complete that I could hear the blood in my own ears. Holmes had spent the early evening in methodical preparation. He moved through the sitting room with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation, adjusting each element of the room with a precision that struck me, at the time, as excessive, but which I would later recognize as the work of a man constructing a stage upon which every prop must be exactly placed. The dispatch box was positioned on the desk, unlocked, with the substitute confession inside, visible but not conspicuously so, as though Holmes had grown careless with its security. A second key, identical to the one on his watch chain, was placed in the top drawer of the desk, partially concealed beneath a stack of correspondence. The lamp on the side table was extinguished. The fire was banked to embers, providing just enough light to navigate the room, but not enough to illuminate its corners. "The temptation," Holmes murmured, adjusting the angle of a chair by 1/2 inch, "is to make things too easy. A document left in plain sight arouses suspicion. A document that requires a small effort to locate, a drawer to open, a box to unlock, satisfies the intruder that he has found what was hidden. The labor of discovery creates the illusion of authenticity." At 10 o'clock, he extinguished the final candle and took up his position. He had chosen the corner behind the door, the darkest point in the room where the shadows were deepest, and the angle of entry from below would place his back against the wall. I was stationed in the adjoining bedroom, the door open a crack, with a clear line of sight to the dispatch box and the window where I would give the signal. My revolver was in my hand. The lamp for signalling Lestrade's men was at my feet. We waited. The first hour passed in silence so dense it seemed to press against the skin. I could hear nothing, no tremor, no vibration, no sound from below. The fire faded to a dull orange glow that barely reached the center of the room. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and I watched the room through the crack in the door with an intensity that made my eyes ache. The clock on the mantelpiece struck midnight, then 1. The silence continued, unbroken, immaculate, mocking. At 1:15 I heard it. Not a sound, a cessation of sound. The faintest draught that had been rising through the floorboards, that subtle mineral exhalation I had learned to detect over the past week, stopped completely, as though a valve had been closed. I understood what this meant. Someone had entered the space beneath the floor and sealed the tunnel behind them, cutting off the airflow. He was here. I held my breath and watched. For several minutes nothing happened. The room remained still, the shadows undisturbed. Then, at the edge of the ember light, I saw a movement so slow and so controlled that I might have dismissed it as imagination. A faint displacement of darkness near the center of the floor, where the marked floorboard lay. The board was rising. It moved upward by fractions, 1/4 of an inch, then half, then an inch, with a smoothness that spoke of engineering rather than brute force. There was no creak, no scrape, no sound whatsoever. The hydraulic jack Holmes had described was doing its work with a precision that was, even in the extremity of my fear, remarkable. A gap appeared, a thin rectangle of deeper blackness in the already dark floor. Through it I felt, rather than saw, a change in the air, a cold current rising from below, carrying with it the scent of earth and stone and something faintly metallic. Oil, perhaps, from the machinery. Then a hand appeared. It emerged from the gap with the deliberate grace of something born to darkness. Long fingers encased in thin, leather gloves, feeling the edge of the board with a sensitivity that was almost surgical. The hand found purchase, steadied itself, and drew the board aside. It was laid flat on the adjacent boards without a whisper of contact. A head followed. In the dim glow of the embers I could make out only the barest outline. A lean face, dark adapted eyes that swept the room in a single comprehensive arc. The man paused, half emerged, his upper body framed by the opening in the floor like a figure rising from a grave. He remained in this position for a full 30 seconds, breathing slowly, listening. Then he pulled himself upward and into the room. He moved with extraordinary economy, every gesture purposeful, every step calculated to distribute his weight across the broadest possible surface area and minimize the stress on the floorboards. He was dressed entirely in dark clothing, close-fitted, with soft-soled boots that made no sound on the oak. A small leather case was strapped to his back. He crossed to the desk. I watched through the crack in the door as Edgar Voss, for it could be no one else, examined the surface of the desk with gloved fingertips, reading its contents by touch. He found the dispatch box. His hands moved over it, locating the lock, assessing its mechanism. Then he reached for the drawer, slid it open with a motion so fluid it might have been rehearsed 100 times, and withdrew the key Holmes had planted there. He unlocked the box. The lid rose without a sound. From his leather case, he produced a second document, the forgery prepared by Halberton's agents, the false confession that was meant to replace the real one and consign the truth to oblivion. He held it in one hand. With the other, he reached into the dispatch box and withdrew the substitute Holmes had placed there. And then he paused. The pause lasted no more than 5 seconds, but in the charged darkness of that room, it felt like an hour. Voss held the document close, to his face, not reading it, I thought, for there was insufficient light, but examining it, feeling the paper, testing its weight, running a gloved thumb along the edge, where the texture of the page would reveal its age and composition. He tilted the document toward the faint glow of the embers, and I saw his lips move. A single word, barely voiced, more shape than sound. I could not hear it, but I saw it, and the word was unmistakable. Clever. He held the document a moment longer, then another. My hand tightened on the revolver. Something in his stillness had changed, a tension in the shoulders, a slight turning of the head, as though he were listening not to the room but to an instinct that had served him through years of military operations in hostile terrain. He knows, I thought. He senses it. Voss looked slowly around the room. His gaze passed over the dispatch box, the desk, the chairs, the bookshelves, cataloguing, assessing, searching for the element that did not belong. It passed over the door behind which I stood, and I felt the weight of those dark adapted eyes like a physical pressure against my chest. Then he looked at the floor. He studied the boards around the opening, the dust patterns, the alignment, the subtle evidence of recent disturbance. I saw his jaw tighten. He glanced back at the document in his hand, then at the dispatch box, then at the room itself, and I understood, with a sickening clarity, that he was performing his own deduction. He was reading the scene the way Holmes read a crime scene, and the scene was telling him something he did not like. He whispered again, louder this time, just enough for me to catch the words through the crack in the door. Clever, but not clever enough. He made his decision. With swift, sure hands, he placed his forgery in the dispatch box, closed the lid, locked it, and returned the key to the drawer. The substitute, Holmes's imitation. He folded once and slipped inside his coat. Then he turned back toward the opening in the floor. He did not reach it. "I would not recommend the return journey, Mr. Voss." Holmes's voice came from the darkness behind the door, calm, conversational, and utterly without warning. It filled the room the way light fills a space when a curtain is drawn, and the effect on Voss was instantaneous. He froze, not with the startled rigidity of a man caught by surprise, but with the controlled stillness of a professional assessing a new variable. "The tunnel is presently being secured at both ends," Holmes continued, stepping forward into the dim light. His face was composed, his hands empty, his posture one of relaxed authority. "Inspector Lestrade's men are at the Dorian Lane entrance. A second team is covering the ventilation shaft on Baker Street. Your associates have been detained." I gave the signal, 3 flashes of the lamp in the window, and heard, within moments, the distant sound of boots on cobblestones. The cavalry was coming. Voss did not move. He stood beside the open floorboard, his hands at his sides, and looked at Holmes with an expression that I found, despite everything, deeply unsettling. Not anger, not fear, not the desperate calculation of a man seeking escape, but something closer to recognition. The look of one craftsman acknowledging the superior work of another. "You knew," Voss said. "I have known for some time." "How long?" "Since the first night you walked past this building and looked at the ground rather than the windows. A man who looks down is not admiring the pavement, Mr. Voss. He is thinking about what lies beneath it." Voss absorbed this. His gaze dropped briefly to the document inside his coat, Holmes's substitute, which he still carried. "The paper," he said. "It felt wrong. The weight was correct, the ink was aged, but there was something in the texture, a smoothness that did not match a document written by a dying man's hand. You prepared a copy." "I did. And the original is safe." Voss nodded slowly. Then, and this was the moment that would haunt me long after the affair had concluded, he smiled. It was a small smile, contained and precise, and it carried within it a quality I had not expected: relief. "You have caught me, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but you have not caught him." "On the contrary," said Holmes. There was a hammering at the front door. I heard Mrs. Hudson's spare key turning in the lock, Lestrade arriving with his men. Boots thundered on the stairs. The sitting-room door burst open, and the room was suddenly full of light and noise, and the heavy breathing of constables who had sprinted through the fog. Voss submitted to arrest without resistance. He stood with his wrists extended, his expression one of quiet composure, as the handcuffs were applied. Lestrade, red-faced and breathing hard, looked from Voss to Holmes to the hole in the floor with an expression of stunned incomprehension. "What in God's name?" "All in good time, Inspector. For now, please ensure that Mr. Voss is treated with the courtesy due to a man who is about to become the Crown's most valuable witness." Voss looked up sharply. "I am no one's witness." "Not yet," said Holmes. "But you will be, because you did something tonight that your employer did not anticipate, something that changes the nature of this entire affair." "And what is that?" Holmes reached into his own coat and withdrew the oilskin packet containing the original confession. "You read the document, Mr. Voss, not merely handled it, read it. I watched you hold it to the light. I saw your lips move. You were memorizing it, committing key passages to memory as insurance against the possibility that Lord Halberton might betray you as he betrayed Sir Malcolm Cray." The colour shifted in Voss's face, a subtle change, barely visible in the lamplight, but enough. "I allowed it," Holmes said softly. "I constructed the substitute with sufficient detail that a man of your intelligence, reading it even briefly, would absorb the essential facts, the names, the dates, the transactions. You now carry in your mind a version of the truth that Halberton has spent a fortune trying to destroy." And that makes you, Mr. Voss, not merely a prisoner, but a witness whose testimony can corroborate every word of the original confession. Voss stared at him. The smile returned. Different this time. Colder. But beneath the coldness, something else. The dawning comprehension of a man who has been outmaneuvered not by force, but by a superior understanding of human nature. You planned this, Voss said. From the beginning, you wanted me to read it. I wanted you to have a reason to cooperate. Lord Halberton will deny everything. The confession alone, written by a dead man, may not be sufficient. But the confession supported by the testimony of the man Halberton hired to destroy it, that, Mr. Voss, is unassailable. The room fell silent. Lestrade's men shifted uncomfortably. The fog pressed against the windows. Voss looked at Holmes for a long time. You are a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes. Only to those who bury the truth, Mr. Voss. Chapter 10. The Trap Beneath Baker Street. The arrest of Edgar Voss in the early hours of November the 14th was, by any conventional measure, the conclusion of the affair. A man had been caught in the act of criminal trespass, in possession of a forged document, at the terminus of an illegally constructed tunnel beneath one of the most famous addresses in London. The evidence was overwhelming. The case, as Lestrade declared with considerable satisfaction on the staircase of 221B, was shut. Holmes said nothing to disabuse him of this belief. He merely asked that Voss be held at Paddington Green under close guard, that no interviews be conducted until Holmes himself was present, and that the tunnel be sealed at both ends but not destroyed. Lestrade, still flushed with the triumph of an operation he had played no part in designing, agreed to all three conditions without objection. It was not until the last constable had departed, the front door had been secured, and the sitting-room restored to something approaching its customary order that Holmes allowed himself to sit down. He looked, for the first time since the affair had begun, genuinely tired. Not the wired exhaustion of a mind running at full capacity, but the deep, settled fatigue of a man who has carried a weight for weeks and is only now beginning to feel its full measure. "It is not over," I said. "No, Watson, it is not over. It has, in fact, only just begun." He stared at the hole in the floor, still open, the darkness below it breathing its cold, mineral breath into the room, and spoke with a quietness that carried more weight than any dramatic declaration. "Voss is a pawn, a brilliant pawn, perhaps the most capable I have ever encountered, but a pawn nonetheless. The hand that moved him is still free, still powerful, and still, at this moment, unaware that anything has gone wrong. Lord Halberton expects to receive word tomorrow morning that the confession has been successfully replaced. When that word does not come, he will know the operation has failed, and then, Watson, he will begin to destroy evidence with the same methodical efficiency with which he has destroyed men. Then we must move quickly. We must move immediately." He rose, crossed to the desk, and began to write, rapidly, in his angular hand, covering 3 sheets of paper in as many minutes. He folded the first and addressed it to Lestrade. The second he addressed to a name I did not recognize, a Mr. Algernon Ford, at an address in Whitehall. The third he sealed without letting me see the addressee. The first instructs Lestrade to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Lord Arthur Halberton on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The second is to a senior official at the Treasury requesting an immediate audit of financial transactions conducted through Blackwall Engineering Associates and 3 related shell companies, whose names I identified in the records young Crewe provided. The third, he held up the sealed letter, the third is to a man I trust who will ensure that copies of Sir Malcolm's confession are placed before dawn in the hands of 3 separate parties: the Lord Chancellor's office, the editor of the Times and the director of the Criminal Investigation Department at Scotland Yard. If anything should happen to the original, if Halberton's reach extends further than I believe, the truth will survive. He rang for a messenger, one of the Baker Street irregulars, a sharp-eyed boy named Cartwright, who had served Holmes on previous occasions and who could be relied upon to deliver sensitive materials with the discretion of a diplomatic courier. 3 deliveries, Holmes told him. The first 2 tonight, the third at first light. You will speak to no one. You will take 3 different routes, and you will not return here until all 3 are done. The boy nodded, pocketed the letters, and vanished into the fog with the practised silence of a child raised on London streets. Holmes turned to me. Now we wait. Again. But this time, Watson, we wait for the machinery of justice to engage, and that machinery, once set in motion, cannot be stopped even by a man of Halberton's influence. We did not sleep. Holmes spent the remaining hours of the night in a state of focused activity that I recognized as the final phase of a long campaign. The consolidation of gains, the securing of flanks, the preparation for the counter-attack he knew would come. He assembled his evidence in a series of labelled folders, the financial records from Crewe, the geological samples from the tunnel, the engineering schematics, the tool dealer's testimony, the forgery recovered from Voss's possession, and the original confession in its oilskin wrapping. Each folder was cross-referenced, annotated, and indexed with a thoroughness that would have impressed the most meticulous solicitor in London. At 7:30, Lestrade arrived with the warrant. At 9 o'clock, Holmes and I accompanied him to the home of Lord Arthur Halberton. The house was in Belgravia, a vast, cream-stuccoed edifice on Eaton Square that radiated the particular kind of quiet authority which only inherited wealth can produce. A butler admitted us with the studied neutrality of a man trained to betray no emotion under any circumstances. We were shown to a morning room whose furnishings alone would have purchased a comfortable house in the suburbs. Halberton kept us waiting for 12 minutes. When he appeared, he was dressed for the day in a suit of impeccable cut, his silver hair combed back from a broad, florid face that bore the unmistakable stamp of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was tall, taller than Holmes, and carried himself with the physical confidence of someone who had never, in 6 decades of privileged existence, been made to feel small. He looked at Lestrade. He looked at the warrant. He looked at Holmes. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was deep, measured, and entirely without tremor. "I shall have my solicitor here within the hour. You will find that this document is not worth the paper on which it is printed." "You are welcome to summon your solicitor, Lord Halberton," said Holmes, "but I should inform you that the warrant is supported by evidence that your solicitor has not yet seen. Evidence that includes the original confession of Sir Malcolm Cray, the testimony of Mr. Alistair Crewe regarding fraudulent payments channeled through your firm, the physical evidence of a tunnel constructed at your expense beneath Baker Street, and the cooperation of Mr. Edgar Voss." At the mention of Voss's name, something changed in Halberton's face. It was not a dramatic shift. The man was too controlled for that, but I saw it clearly. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional hardening of the jaw, the involuntary response of a man who has just learned that a wall he believed impregnable has been breached. "Voss," he repeated. "I do not know anyone by that name." "Then you will be surprised to learn that he knows you rather well. He has provided a detailed account of your instructions, your payments, and your involvement in the murder of Sir Malcolm Cray, an account that corroborates in every material particular the confession Sir Malcolm left in my care. The confession of a dead man and the word of a criminal. Neither would survive 5 minutes in court. Individually, perhaps not. But together, reinforced by the financial records, the engineering evidence, the testimony of your own solicitor's clerk, and the physical forgery recovered from the tunnel, They form a case that no jury in England would dismiss. Holmes stepped forward. His voice, which had been measured, throughout, dropped to a register I had heard him use only in moments of the gravest consequence. "You made 2 errors, Lord Halberton. The first was to underestimate Sir Malcolm Cray, to believe that a man you had controlled for 16 years would go to his grave without leaving behind the truth. He was braver than you knew. Broken, perhaps. Compromised, certainly. But brave enough, at the last, to write it all down. And the second error? The second was to build a tunnel beneath the consulting room of Sherlock Holmes, and believe that it would go unnoticed." Halberton said nothing. He stood in his beautiful morning room, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of wealth and influence, and I watched as the architecture of his composure developed its first visible cracks. His gaze moved from Holmes to Lestrade to the warrant and back to Holmes, and in that circuit I saw the calculation of a man running through his options and finding, one by one, that each had been foreclosed. "I wish to speak with my solicitor," he said. "That is your right," said Lestrade, "but you will do so from Bow Street." The arrest proceeded without incident. Halberton submitted with the cold dignity of a man who has resolved to fight the battle on different ground, in the courtroom, through the press, by whatever means his fortune and connections could still command. He was escorted to a waiting carriage, and as he descended the steps of his own house, flanked by constables, he turned and looked back at Holmes with an expression I shall carry with me to the end of my days. It was not hatred, it was not contempt, it was the look of a man who had finally encountered the one obstacle his power could not overcome, and who understood with perfect clarity that he had brought it upon himself. The trial of Lord Arthur Halberton commenced in January of 1896 and lasted 9 days. The evidence assembled by Holmes proved, as he had predicted, devastating. Crewe's financial records established the funding chain. The geological samples and engineering evidence proved the tunnel's existence and purpose. The forgery recovered from the dispatch box was traced, through its paper and ink, to a printer in Cheapside, who identified Halberton's intermediary. And Edgar Voss, who had accepted Holmes's offer of cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge, provided testimony that dismantled Halberton's defence with the precision of the same man who had built the tunnel. Voss was, I must acknowledge, a compelling witness. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had decided, at last, to tell the truth. Not from remorse, I suspected, but from the cold pragmatism of a soldier who recognizes when a position is no longer defensible. He described Halberton's instructions, the recruitment of the tunnel crew, the months of preparation, and the final operation beneath Baker Street, with a clarity and detail that left no room for doubt. When asked by the prosecution why he had agreed to undertake the operation, he replied simply, "Because I was told the document was a forgery, that Sir Malcolm had been coerced into writing lies by parties who wished to destroy Lord Halberton. I believed I was recovering a slander, not suppressing a truth." Whether this was genuine or self-serving, I could not determine. Holmes, when I asked his opinion, merely said, "It does not matter what Voss believed, Watson. It matters what the jury believes. And the jury believes him." Halberton was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years' imprisonment, a sentence that, given his age, amounted to a life term. The peripheral figures, Hartwell, the complicit solicitor, and the members of the tunnel crew received lesser sentences. Mrs. Genevieve Paris, whose role in the affair had troubled me throughout, was never charged. Holmes, when pressed, would say only that her position was more complex than it appeared, and that the truth of her involvement was a matter he preferred to leave unresolved. She was either an honest woman trying to bring a murderer to justice, he said, or a very clever one trying to ensure that the confession reached the right hands by the most indirect possible route. In either case, Watson, she achieved her purpose. I am not inclined to punish efficiency. The tunnel itself was filled in by order of the Metropolitan Board of Works, though not before Holmes had conducted a thorough survey of its entire length. He described it to me in one of our quieter evenings as the finest piece of covert engineering he had ever encountered, a remark I found telling, for it suggested a respect for Voss that went beyond the professional and touched on something closer to kinship. "He was wasted on crime, Watson," Holmes said, staring into the fire. "A man of his abilities, properly directed, could have built railways across continents. Instead, he built a passage through the dark for a man who did not deserve his loyalty and would have discarded him without a moment's hesitation. And Sir Malcolm? Was justice served? Sir Malcolm is dead. Justice for the dead is an abstraction. But the truth he tried to preserve has survived, carried through a tunnel, across a courtroom, and into the public record, where it cannot be erased. That, I think, is the best we can offer him." He fell silent for a time. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. The floor beneath us was solid and whole, the boards level, the room restored to its familiar geometry. But I knew, and Holmes knew, that beneath that solidity lay a memory of darkness, of patience, of hands reaching upward through the earth. "They believed the truth could be rewritten with ink and paper," Holmes said at last, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the flames. "But truth, Watson, is not so easily altered. It adapts, it waits, and when the moment is right—" He turned to me, and in the firelight his face was grave and calm and certain. "It exposes those who tried to bury it.